welcome to week 2 of PPA 551. This week we're going to get into some actual course content, but before we start, I did want to show you what your home screen on Canvas is going to look like and talk a little bit about the flow of the class. So what you see up on the screen right here is the introduction, the before you begin for this week's module. Each week, this will become your home page. It will replace the previous week's home page, and it will give you a list of things that you can do to make sure that you're following the proper flow of the course, hitting all the readings, making sure you're watching a video lecture, everything like that. And then if there's additional stuff I want you to take a look at, such as this week suggesting a name for our Build-A-City, I'll be able to put this in here so you'll log right into our Canvas page and see immediately what you need to be doing for the week right away. So just want to show you what that looks like when this module goes live. This will be what your homepage looks like. So I just want to show you that. Now we can get into the actual content. So obviously, it's really important for us as HR professionals, as burgeoning HR professionals, to understand what the workforce looks like. It is really a good baseline for us as burgeoning professionals to take a look and say, okay, here are the dynamics that we're currently playing with, and what impact does that have on the way we see our work. So, you know, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has drastically impacted the way that we think about work, and we're going to talk about those things. But just because the COVID-19 pandemic happened doesn't mean that these larger trends have changed all too much. For example, the aging out of many of the people in our workforce has been a trend that's been occurring since the 1990s. And we want to be able to understand the effect that that has, while also knowing the new and changing dynamics of our workforce because of COVID-19 and the Great Resignation. So we'll talk a little bit about the aging workforce to begin. Then we're going to talk about government and nonprofit workforce participation. This is really important because a lot of labor market analysis you're going to see, whether you're looking at specific job types, specific job categories like industrial workers, each is going to have something different. The same is absolutely true for government and nonprofit workplaces, and so we want to understand what that labor market looks like as well, and then we'll close by talking about COVID-19 and the Great Resignation. Wonderful. So these numbers would obviously be updated if they conducted the survey today, but back in 2016, we're looking at 45% of employees ages 55 or older, so kind of in that aging out period of their career, were expecting to retire at the age of 65, which is not something that was the case before. What we do know is that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that number has escalated, and we've seen a string of early retirements that may not have been anticipated before. Employees that may not have said they were going to retire at 65, who, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, were retiring at the ages of 64 or 63, depending on their place in their individual lives. The aging workforce is really fascinating because it kind of creates these bizarre, seemingly conflicting trends that we can take a look at. So by 2029, we're projected to have 3.8 million boomers in our workplace turning 65. That is a large number, right? However, since 2010, the boomer labor force as a whole has been declining on average year over year. So you're saying, okay, great, boomers are making up less and less of a share of the workforce. That's not necessarily the case. What we're seeing with our workforce participation is that workers over 60 are almost double the number of workers under 30. So what we have is a very older generation heavy workforce participation in the general workforce that we can analyze. When we're looking at federal government workers, they're generally older than private sector workers, as are state and local government workers, 44 compared to 39, right? So when we're talking about aging, this is not necessarily a bad thing always. So the economic development the economic benefit is many people feel secure enough to retire. That is a big part of how our economy functions and how our workplaces function, is we want people, when they turn the appropriate age, to feel comfortable retiring and moving into that next phase in their life, which then opens up slots in the workforce for younger people looking to start their career as well. For the economy as a whole, economic growth depends on labor force participation, and uh, and it depends on labor force growth. And boomers staying in the workforce actually bolsters the growth in the labor force as well. There's less of a fiscal dependency on Social Security, which may help the pending insolvency of Social Security and Medicare that we may see in the coming years. And there's more taxes being collected. Income tax that may not have been collected by people turning 65 is still being collected, which has a huge impact on a lot of our government budgets as well. Now, as a young person in the workforce, as all of you are, you know that the aging workforce is not necessarily a universal good thing for us, right? One of the things that's happening is that as our workforce becomes older and older, we are seeing a mass loss of what we would call institutional knowledge. The people who have been working in these positions, in these organizations, carry a lot of lived experience that teaches them how to do their jobs well. However, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and because of these larger trends in aging, we're losing that institutional knowledge in droves. The problem also is that, going back to the numbers we saw in the previous slide, there's not enough young people to actually take those places and fill in those gaps. So not only are we losing that knowledge, but we're losing the ability to have people even in those positions in the first place. Because of that, we're looking at drags on the rest of our organization. Uptraining people to take over the position of retiring people takes time, it takes money. We're losing a lot of knowledge because most organizations, mine in particular, do not have the ability to transfer this knowledge en masse to new employees. There's not a lot of cross training, not a lot of an ability to have that sort of knowledge transferred when people leave. And this creates an increased reliance on contractors. When you can't hire a position, that doesn't make the position not necessary. Instead, you as an HR professional, you as a hiring manager, have to find different ways to fill those gaps. And we often turn to contractors to do that. And so that creates accountability issues with who's actually overseeing these contractors. And it creates a cost problem where, like, on the short term we're saving money, but on the long term we're not building any sort of organizational culture or anything that's going to drive what our organization looks like into the future. So as you're thinking about the aging workforce, what I want you to think about is that in the organizations you work for, you currently work for, you've interned for, anything like that, have you noticed the aging occurring? Are there large portions of people who are close to retiring? And if so, is that something that's being discussed? One of the concepts that we'll talk about throughout the course is the concept of succession planning. In my organization, we have a significant amount of our executive leadership are older. Our deputy city managers, our department directors are nearing that retirement age. So, as a proactive step to deal with the consequences of that, our organization has undertaken a concerted effort in succession planning of mapping out who currently in the organization fills in those gaps as people retire. It's not a foolproof system, but it's important to understand that we have to devote resources to that, because if we start losing these people, especially these people in these leadership roles, we're losing a lot of knowledge and we're losing a lot of momentum that we may have otherwise had. So as you're thinking about the aging workforce, as you're thinking about your discussion, this is what I want you to start thinking about when we're talking about the aging workforce. Let's turn now to the federal workforce. So, the federal workforce has similar aging problems, but let's take a look at race instead, right? So these numbers are drastically different than they were in the past, and if you're interested in this, there's links in this in the slide right here where you can go and see these trends over time. But when we're looking at the federal workforce, the trends are obvious. Entry-level employees are becoming more and more diverse. More and more people of color, more and more people in the BIPOC community are filling those GS1 to those GS9s, those entry-level positions within the federal government. However, as you start moving up the chain of command to those mid-level, to those senior level, and to the career senior executive service people, the percentage of people of color goes down. This is a trend that we see across the board, whether you're talking about business, whether you're talking about government. But regardless of how diverse the workforce is, the labor pool you can draw from, once people are in your organizations, you need a concerted effort to keep that diversity moving all the way up the chain. We obviously have some equity concerns when we're talking about access to higher education or continuing education programs. Is that access being treated equally geographically, racially, socioeconomically? How is that changing, and what are we doing as a federal organization in supporting that sort of stuff? State and local government is another interesting case study to look at in terms of how the workforce is changing over time. So when we're talking about state and local government workers, this is anyone who works for, let's say, the state of Colorado's Department of Transportation, out there messing up all of our highways all the time, and we're very grateful for them doing that. Or you're talking about people like me working in local government, or you're talking about people working in special districts, school districts, that sort of stuff. The change from 2013 to 2018 has been noted. As you can see, a lot of those high service demand positions have grown. Transit, like I said, Department of Transportation, right? Hospitals and health, this has done nothing but increase in need and decrease in supply because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the burnout we've seen within our healthcare professionals. Parks and recreation, fire protection, health, all of these like super public, externally facing positions that serve a specific need have grown a ton since 2013. You're also seeing growth within the administrative positions, within finance administration, within other general government administration, city management. We talk about natural resources, legal, and then you're also seeing, these protection type the protection type departments, your police, your fire, your natural resources, your water, and then your community services like your libraries, and then your Department of Corrections. Now there's an interesting trend here, right? Because one of the declines that we've seen is in highway workers specifically. So that refers specifically to state highway employees. And then also in housing and community development, there's been a backwards trend in that as well. I would argue that what we're seeing right now with the lack of affordable housing in places like Colorado may be part and parcel with our lack of investment, either through our employees or otherwise, in housing and community development at a state and local level. Again, if you're interested in these trends more, you can click the links here. So we talk about public sector, right? We talk about this growing diversity within our government workers, and these kind of disparate trends depending on what services you're providing, what needs you're meeting within state and local government. But there's just general challenges that we as government employees have a hard time overcoming when it comes to hiring and building up our workforce. So millennials are projected to make up 75%, 3/4 of the global workforce by 2025. That is an incredible amount of the labor market share that millennials are controlling. However, only 27% of those millennials work in the public sector. Start thinking about why that might be. What are the deterrents for working in the public sector? Listen, not everyone can be super altruistic and public service motivated like you and me. Sometimes people have realistic needs that they have to meet instead. So we're talking about time to hire. That's one of the biggest barriers for millennials. Millennials know that if they're applying, they need to work. They want to work. They want to hear back. And with time to hire is somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 days within an organization like mine, you're losing candidates as that process drags on. There's also, with political instability, especially at the federal level, there's less job security than there used to be. Government work used to be seen as the pinnacle of job security. You had your Pendleton protections, you had your other merit-based hiring protections that kept you secure in your position, that had pros and cons all the way around. But with political instability, you see politicians, especially at the national level, talking about cutting specific positions, going into individual departments and cutting the funding for the pay for the benefits of specific positions in CDC, in the FBI, in these really critical positions. And so there's less job security than there used to be. That's a draw factor that we as government workers can't rely on as heavily as we used to. Salaries are also generally lower. Now, this is something that we'll talk about when we get to compensation, but when we're talking about salaries, in general, when you're looking at positions, the salary difference isn't too dramatic. However, it's that growth potential that a lot of millennials are looking at, and they're just not seeing within public sector work, within government work. Working in government is hard. There's a lot of red tape and inefficient processes. This is all I talk about at my workplace all the time is how annoying it is that we have all of these inefficient, paper-bound processes that make jobs harder. Then that red tape not only frustrates the employee, but it's also frustrating the customer. Who does the customer then take that out on? It's the employee who had nothing to do with the inefficient process in the first place. So that's something that creates a barrier. No one wants to be the one enforcing red tape. There's also a perception, especially at the federal level, that government is just behind the times when it comes to a lot of workplace trends. Incredibly siloed workplaces are not what millennials and especially Gen Z are looking for. They're looking for collaborative open workspaces that they can make a difference in. And so organizations slowly are, catching up with the times, and the COVID-19 pandemic has definitely pushed us towards more work flexibility, more remote work, hybrid work schedules to try to catch us up. But it was something that we're still playing catch up on as a public sector as a whole. And then there's, because of the difficulties in hiring, we kind of have a snake eating its own tail situation where, okay, now we can't hire people, so then we're hiring contractors. So then contractors can say, look at all the jobs we can provide to you, employees, and won't take as long to hear back from you. Our processes are simpler. There's less red tape. We're maybe able to pay more. There's more flexibility, more consistency. And so, in a way, we as a government are reinforcing these trends that we are suffering from as a result of the new age of work. Obviously, these trends are massively accelerated because of COVID-19, and data is continually coming out on what hiring looks like in this modern workforce. But these trends, especially when we're looking at millennials, are really, really scary when we're looking at the future of government work. So, as you're thinking about the trends in public sector work, when you're thinking about the trends in government work, have you seen these trends happen within your own organization? So, for example, one of the first process improvements I worked on with our HR department in Commerce City was how long it took to hire lifeguards. You don't think about that from an external perspective when you talk about hiring. They're seasonal employees. They're generally younger. We're hiring generally 16 to 18-year-olds. But the time to hire became a huge issue because we were taking anywhere from 9 to 21 days to hire a lifeguard. Because of all the background checks, they have to be drug tested. There's all these different things. What we were hearing from younger people who may otherwise work for us as lifeguards was, well, you pay just as much as JCPenney's does, and JCPenney's will hire me and I can start making money the next day. And so we have seen that we are falling behind when it comes to competing for that workforce. This small little microcosm of seasonal lifeguards, we're seeing that trend play itself out through and through, and we had a hard time staffing lifeguards, as a lot of organizations, a lot of local governments did this past summer. And so we worked to lower our time to hire, which is now closer to 2 to 4 days, but we'll see when we actually ramp back up for this year how well that holds and whether or not we're seeing those trends continue. Okay, cool. We've talked about trends. We've talked about all this sort of stuff. Now let's talk about COVID. COVID has had a massive impact on the way that the workforce looks like. Let's take a look at all sectors of our workforce, all sectors of our economy really quickly. So the biggest drop you're seeing down here is your leisure and hospitality. this makes a ton of sense, right? With a lot of the economic closures that had to happen because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you're not seeing as many people travel. You're not seeing as many people going out to eat or going out to leisure or recreational places. And so you're seeing a massive decline in that workforce. Then, second, government. The second place we're seeing is a lot of people leaving the government workforce. Close behind is education and health services, which I would lump in with government in a lot of ways. You're seeing this mass exodus. You can attribute that largely to the trends of inflexibility, of inefficient processes, but you could also look individually at, let's talk about education, for example. School districts are having a hard time retaining teachers because of how how toxic those work cultures are perceived to be. As a person who is proudly married to a public school teacher, I have seen that firsthand of how the workplace, especially since COVID, has really changed and affected their commitment to their positions. And then you're looking at these other fourth level positions, these professional and business services. You're looking at retail, and then you're seeing the smaller declines in manufacturing, information, wholesale. But on the whole, the declines are exactly where we needed, where we would expect them to be. That doesn't make it not a problem. And we have to, as a sector writ large, and as a country, come to terms with the impact of massive declines in government workers, massive declines in education workers, and healthcare workers, in business services and social services. We really will have to come to terms with what that means down the line. Nonprofits really had a hard time with the COVID-19 pandemic. Unsurprising, right? Whereas one of the benefits that the public sector has is a steady economic base. It's pretty predictable when it comes to whether or not a job is going to exist or not. Nonprofits don't have that same benefit. They're often funded entirely by donors or by specific organizations, and so that creates difficulty. So across the nonprofit sector, when you're seeing these declines, you're seeing arts, entertainment, and recreation, similar to what we saw on the last slide. You're seeing more than a third of the workforce leave. Educational services. This has a huge impact on our ability of our education system's ability to meet the needs of their students. You're seeing a decline in those nonprofits as well. Religious, grant-making, civic, professional, this kind of catch-all for those 501c3s, those 501c4s. Those are declining. They lost about 10% of their workforce as well. Healthcare, social assistance. You're seeing massive trends that I think were always a fear within the nonprofit sector that have now come to full fruition, and you're seeing these trends across the board really impact the nonprofit's ability to meet their mission. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, something that we as burgeoning HR professionals need to understand when it comes to what COVID-19 did to our workforce. We can look at these trends writ large and say, oh wow, we're losing 1.4 million people over the course of a year, leaving the government sector, blah blah blah. That's really scary. We can talk about that, but let's take a look at it by sex. So up to 2019, we were seeing parity when it comes to men and women's participation in the labor force. This has been a massive problem for organizations trying to increase diversity, increase access to their work, because traditionally, women have not participated in the workforce as much. If you went back a little bit further, you'd see a massive spike because of World War II. But in general, women participated in the workforce at a much lower level than men did. But as we turn to the 21st century, we're close to parity. We're close to that. We're close to that evening out. But then COVID happens, and what happens? Well, those traditional understandings and beliefs about who is the breadwinner in a household, who is responsible for taking care of children, those all reared their ugly heads right away, and you're seeing massive declines in women with children and men with children, as opposed to men without children. The impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on women's participation in the workforce is something that we are going to be looking at and dealing with the consequences of for generations. It is a massive setback when we're talking about this parity, when you're talking about equity in the workforce, because there was just this belief and this understanding that women were the ones that had to leave to take care of their kids. And, you know, even with men who are taking care of their children, you're seeing a bigger decline than men without children. But that massive gap when we're talking about women with children, that's really difficult. The era of the do-it-all mom, the mom who could have a career, have be a really engaged mother, that we were working really hard as a society to get there, that took a massive blow because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we look at young people, right? And one of the things that COVID-19 has revealed is that the values are very clearly shifting from generation to generation about what matters to them in the workforce. After the main bulk of the pandemic ended and a lot of organizations started returning to work, you started seeing employees just leave. And a lot of them cited this idea that they worked from home for 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18 months, and they don't see a need to commute back into work. They were doing their jobs just fine, and they prefer the flexibility that comes with a hybrid work model. This is only one of many value differences that we're going to explore as we talk about the change in our workforce over time that we as HR professionals need to be able to deal with, and we need to be able to cope with these changes. One of the stories I really like to think about and really got me thinking deeply about this issue is my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law has been retired for I think 4 or 5 years now, and my wife, like I said, who was a public school teacher, decided that she needed to pursue higher education, go get her master's degree, kind of rediscover her love for learning, love for education, because it had kind of been lost because of the trends, both with the COVID-19 pandemic and also with gun safety and health and care for their students, everything like that. My wife decided to go back to school, and she was telling her mom about why she made that decision, and her mom said, "Well, I'm not sure. I feel like I've never had a job that I liked, but I worked through it." And to me, that was galling. It was incredible to hear someone say, like, well, you don't have to like what you do, because as someone on that young millennial Gen Z cusp, I have always thought about, like, I'm going to spend so much of my life working, I'm going to find purpose in the work that I do. My wife sees it the same way, and a lot of people in this generation, in this age range, feel that same way. But if you're looking at people who are in that boomer era, the boomer generation, they didn't see it that way. So when we talk about we want meaning in our work, when we talk about we want flexibility in our work, a lot of older people are looking at that and not being able to relate to it, not being able to see it, and that's creating tensions as well that we'll talk about here in a second. So here, what we're going to do right here is we're going to watch a video. This is a German workforce analyst, and he did this excellent TED Talk talking about the problems that we're going to have with the workforce in 2030.
2014 is a very special year for me. 20 years as a consultant, 20 years of marriage, and I'm turning 50 in 1 month. That means I was born in 1964 in a small town in Germany. It was a gray November day, and I was overdue. The hospital's maternity ward was really stressed out because a lot of babies were born on this gray November day. As a matter of fact, 1964 was the year with the highest birth rate ever in Germany, more than 1.3 million. Last year, we just had over 600,000, so half of my number. What you can see here is the German age pyramid. And there, the small black point at the top, that's me. In red, you can see the potential working age population. So people over 15 and under 65. And I'm actually only interested in this red area. Now, let's do a simple simulation of how this age structure will develop over the next couple of years. As you can see, the peak is moving to the right, and I, with many other baby boomers, will retire in 2030. By the way, I don't need any forecasts of birth rates for predicting this red area. The red area, so the potential working age population in 2030, is already set in stone today, except for much higher migration rates. And if you compare this red area in 2030 with the red area in 2014, it is much, much smaller. So before I show you the rest of the world, what does this mean for Germany? So what we know from this picture is that labor supply, so people who provide labor, will go down in Germany and will go down significantly. Now, what about labor demand? That's where it gets tricky. As you might know, the consultant's favorite answer to any question is, it depends. So I would say it depends. We didn't want to forecast the future, highly speculative. We did something else. We looked at the GDP and productivity growth of Germany over the last 20 years and calculated the following scenario. If Germany wants to continue this GDP and productivity growth, we could directly calculate how many people Germany would need to support this growth. And this is the green line, labor demand. So Germany will run into a major talent shortage very quickly. 8 million people are missing, which is more than 20% of our current workforce. So big numbers, really big numbers. And we calculated several scenarios, and the picture always looked like this. Now, to close the gap, Germany has to significantly increase migration, get many more women in the workforce, increase retirement age. By the way, we just lowered it this year, and all these measures at once. If Germany fails here, Germany will stagnate. We won't grow anymore. Why? Because the workers are not there who can generate this growth. And companies will look for talents somewhere else. But where? Now, we simulated labor supply and labor demand for the largest 15 economies in the world, representing more than 70% of world GDP. And the overall picture looks like this by 2020. Blue indicates a labor surplus, red indicates a labor shortfall, and gray are those countries which are borderline. So by 2020, we still see a labor surplus in some countries, like Italy, France, the US. But this picture will change dramatically by 2030. By 2030, we will face a global workforce crisis in most of our largest economies, including 3 out of the 4 BRIC countries. China, with its former one-child policy, will be hit, as well as Brazil and Russia. Now, to tell the truth, in reality, the situation will be even more challenging. What you can see here are average numbers. We de-averaged them and broke them down to different skill levels. And what we found were even higher shortfalls for high-skilled people and a partial surplus for low-skilled workers. So on top of an overall labor shortage, we will face a big skill mismatch in the future. And this means huge challenges in terms of education, qualification, upskilling for governments and companies. Now, the next thing we looked into was robots, automation, technology. Will technology change this picture and boost productivity? Now, a short answer would be that our numbers already include a significant growth in productivity driven by technology. A long answer would go like this. Let's take Germany again. The Germans have a certain reputation in the world when it comes to productivity. In the 90s, I worked in our Boston office for almost 2 years. And when I left, an old senior partner told me literally, "Send me more of these Germans, they work like machines." That was 1998. 16 years later, you would probably say the opposite. "Send me more of these machines, they work like Germans." Technology will replace a lot of jobs, regular jobs, not only in the production industry, but even office workers are in jeopardy and might be replaced by robots, artificial intelligence, big data, or automation. So the key question is not if technology replaces some of these jobs, but when, how fast, and to what extent. Or in other words, will technology help us to solve this global workforce crisis? Yes and no. This is a more sophisticated version of it depends. Let's take the automotive industry as an example, because there more than 40% of industrial robots are already working, and automation has already taken place. In 1980, less than 10% of the production cost of a car was caused by electronic parts. Today, this number is more than 30%, and it will grow to more than 50% by 2030. And these new electronic parts and applications require new skills and have created a lot of new jobs, like the cognitive systems engineer, who optimizes the interaction between driver and electronic system. In 1980, no one had the slightest clue that such a job would ever exist. As a matter of fact, the overall number of people involved in the production of the car has only changed slightly in the last decades, despite of robots and automation. So what does this mean? Yes, technology will replace a lot of jobs, but we will also see a lot of new jobs and new skills on the horizon. And that means technology will worsen our overall skill mismatch. And this kind of de-averaging reveals the crucial challenge for governments and businesses. So people, high-skilled people, talents, will be the big thing in the next decade. If they are the scarce resource, we have to understand them much better. Are they actually willing to work abroad? What are their job preferences? To find out, this year we conducted a global survey among more than 200,000 job seekers from 189 countries. Migration is certainly one, let's say, key measure to close a gap, at least in the short term. So we asked about mobility. More than 60% of these 200,000 job seekers are willing to work abroad. For me, a surprisingly high number. If you look at the employees aged 21 to 30, this number is even higher.
I could imagine.
If you split this number up by country,
This number would be dramatically
yes,
different.
the world is mobile, but only partly. The least mobile countries are Russia, Germany, and the US. Now, where do these people like to move to? Number 7 is Australia, where 28% could imagine moving to. Then France, Switzerland, Germany, Canada, UK, and top choice worldwide is the US. Now, what are the job preferences of these 200,000 people? So what are they looking for? Out of a list of 26 topics, salary is only number 8. The top 4 topics.
Can I pause right there? I think that that's really important to see. One of the trends that we're going to see when it comes to this mismatch in job availability and talent is that governments and nonprofits, they just don't pay enough. People value money too much, and so it's important to understand that over and over again, back 2014, even today, salary is only one of many considerations that people make when they're talking about what sort of jobs they're looking for.
are all around culture. Number 4, having a great relationship with the boss. 3, enjoying a great work-life balance. 2, having a great relationship with colleagues. And top priority worldwide is being appreciated for your work. So do I get a thank you? Not only once a year with the annual bonus payment, but every day. And now our global workforce crisis becomes very personal. People are looking for recognition. Aren't we all looking for recognition in our jobs? Now, let me connect the dots. We will face a global workforce crisis, which consists of an overall labor shortage, plus a huge skill mismatch, plus a big cultural challenge. And this global workforce crisis is approaching very fast. Right now, we are just at the turning point. So what can governments, what can companies do? Every company, but also every country, needs a people strategy and act on it immediately. And such a people strategy consists out of 4 parts. Number 1, a plan for how to forecast supply and demand for different jobs and different skills. Workforce planning will become more important than financial planning. 2, a plan for how to attract great people. Generation Y, women, but also retirees. 3, a plan for how to educate and upskill them. There's a huge upskilling challenge ahead of us. And 4, for how to retain the best people. Or in other words, how to realize an appreciation and relationship culture. However, one crucial underlying factor is to change our attitudes. Employees are resources, are assets, not costs, not headcounts, not machines, not even the Germans. Thank you.
I really like that because not only is it super pertinent today when we're talking about like our people strategy, right? But really his closing thesis of being able to show appreciation for the people that we work for. This is not something that HR has traditionally been focused on. You know, HR looked at the word retention and wanted to look at data and how they could increase retention rates. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, and especially after, we have started to think differently about the way that we treat people. Like he said, people are not headcounts. They're not numbers. They're not data. They're not costs. They're resources. Their value adds to our organization. And so it's important to think about people differently. Your discussion post for this week is based largely on this TED Talk and the themes around it. And I want you to really think critically about what parts of his argument are really, really important today. Are there parts of his argument that are less important today because of the changes we've seen in the workforce? And really, how does that affect our industries in the public and nonprofit sectors? So let's talk a little bit about the Great Resignation. So this is my soapbox, and I will get on and off of this soapbox repeatedly throughout this course. But the Great Resignation is, I think, a misnomer. Because the Great Resignation has been framed as such because it's been seen as people leaving their workplaces for no other option. I teach a local government 101 course, and when we talk about hiring in that course, I hear these refrains constantly from people. It's like, oh, well, COVID-19 showed that people don't need to work as hard anymore, that they can rely more on unemployment and all these different sort of things. And frankly, the framing of the Great Resignation only helps drive that misunderstanding of why people are actually leaving the workforce. This is not an ideological agenda. This is a practical discussion that we as HR professionals have to have if we want to figure out how we're going to meet the challenges that Strauch pointed out in his TED Talk. So, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a mass exodus both during the core of the pandemic, during a lot of the shutdowns, and then especially afterwards. In HR, we look at this and we call these quits. What's driving the quits in our organization, right? And just like what we saw in the TED Talk, one of the major reasons is pay. Obviously, that's important, but this is across the board, right? This isn't talking just about government. Pay was too low. No opportunities for advancement, right? We're seeing these. What are we looking for as workers in our workplaces, right? Felt disrespected as a major reason. I think that's really important to point out that culture is really part of it. Child care. We're looking back at the effect that the disparate impact of COVID-19 on men and women in the workforce, right? And then flexible work schedules, hybrid work schedules, these sort of things. People are leaving their workplaces because they know that they can make similar money and have a more flexible work schedule. And how can we do more to support these changing values within our workplace? In response to the Great Resignation, there's kind of been, I would say, it's spanned across the entire spectrum of what we would consider in terms of response. Organizations have conducted equity studies. So one of the things, especially in government, we look at is, is our pay, are our benefits competitive? Um, and so we will make equity adjustments to our workplaces to make sure that either specific positions, specific departments, or the organization writ large is remaining competitive within their own labor markets. In Commerce City, we always compare ourselves to the Denver metro area labor market at large. And in 2021, we realized that we needed to actually increase salaries across the board by close to 3% to stay competitive within that labor market. In specific positions, that wasn't even enough. The problem with this response in a lot of ways is that how you're determining compensation can lead to some skews in your results. For example, a lot of times when we look at compensation, we're taking a total salary, and that factors in the benefits that a lot of us, especially people who are looking more towards stable careers, are looking for. The health benefits, the child care benefits, the life insurance, dental, medical, pet insurance, all these different things that it factored into those benefits nowadays. However, one of the things that we're noticing within the job market is that, especially Gen Z, they're opting out of these benefits in a lot of ways. They don't see a need for health insurance, for life insurance at that stage in their career. They're looking for increase in take home. So if we're looking and saying, why are we having such a hard time hiring young people? And we're saying, well, our health insurance is so good. Obviously, there's a mismatch there. Obviously, we're missing something in the way that we're calculating that. One of the other things that we've had to do is increase our workforce development programming. This has unfortunately been too little too late in terms of actually addressing the problem. Especially in those highly skilled positions, if we do not have the ability to uptrain people, to build in pipelines of workers that can fill these positions, these highly technical positions, we're never going to meet those needs. And unfortunately, for a while, government has really suffered, especially at the state and local level, from not enough investment in workforce development. We now see there's a need for that, but we're playing catch up at this point instead of addressing the problem head on when it could have had a greater impact. And finally, this is something I want you to be thinking about as well as we talk, is that there's increases in the strain between generations in the workplace. I have sat in on plenty of hiring, interviews, panel interviews, anything like that, and I have heard older managers, older hiring managers talk about their frustrations with younger employees just not wanting to work as hard or not wanting to, they say stuff like, well, I've always had to commute from work, so I don't understand why that's such a problem for people. And that lack of empathy or sympathy in thinking about the workforce is going to increase the problems that we're seeing between these generations. And as we've seen, we can't just wait for the older people to age out of the workforce entirely. We need that transition. We need to be able to pass that knowledge on from generation to generation to keep our organizations stable. So the Great Resignation has created a number of problems that have only exacerbated what Strauch was talking about in his TED Talk. So as you're thinking about the Strauch piece and kind of this lecture writ large, and we start thinking about these core questions that face HR and the changing in our workforce, really think about what has the pandemic done to these trends that were already existing. Sometimes the trends have just been accelerated in the same direction. This desire for more flexibility has been something that's kind of been percolating for a while, and it's been accelerated. Or the trends have been completely neutered. When we're looking at labor parity when it comes to gender in the workforce. Women are now declining in their share of the workforce, whereas we were close to parity before, and that faces a lot of problems. Also be thinking about this Great Resignation, how it's impacted the labor market, what you're seeing in your organizations in terms of both the practical impacts and practical responses, and also the value-based responses that you're seeing in as a result of the Great Resignation. So, in summary, super high level, super overview, kind of dipping our toes in the questions that we need to be asking, right? Our workforce is getting older. That's not changed. COVID-19 has taken a lot of problems that we were kind of hoping we wouldn't have to deal with and put them on hyperspeed. And now we have to deal with things like equity in the workforce, like childcare, like flexibility, like inefficient work processes. All of these different things we have to now deal with, or we face not having employees in positions to do the work we need. We need to, as public and nonprofit organizations, do a better job of trying to understand where younger workers are coming from, because if we're not building those talent pipelines, if we're not hiring those younger people, that the share of the workforce that those older people are taking up is not going to change whether or not we can hire their replacements. So we need to have a better plan on hiring younger people, and a more diverse group of younger people as well. And finally, we need to think about values too. A lot of times we really get bogged down in numbers. And what is beautiful about the conversations that we have within the HR world, within the people services world, is that people aren't just numbers. People have values, they have individual interests, and we as organizations, as HR departments, and as people need to know what we value and whether that's aligning with what the workforce is looking like. If so, how can we maximize on that? How can we use that as a way to attract people? And if not, how can we reevaluate and meet the labor market where it is? We can't paddle upstream this entire time. So, I also want you to start thinking about, as we move into the core content for the course, I want you to start thinking about your workforce plan. You can go onto Canvas and start reading through those resources. Please, as you're reading this, be asking questions, reaching out to me sooner rather than later. The way that online classes work is that it's going to quickly become too much. And so if you have those questions, don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed by it. Ask those questions up front, do the due diligence up front to set yourself up for success, because I think that this project in particular is going to add a lot of value for you on your career journeys. Next steps, remember, respond to the discussion by Thursday, and then reply to 2 of your colleagues by Sunday. I'm excited to see what sort of dialogues, what sort of conversations we're having, and I'll use that, the where the conversations have led, I'll use that to kind of cater what our discussions look like going forward. Be thinking about your workforce plan and timeline. That's coming up next week. That's due soon. So if you haven't had that conversation, if you haven't started thinking about it, now is the time to do so. As we go into next week's content, we're going to start the basics of HR management, the nitty-gritty of what it takes to be an HR manager and HR professional. So that is where we're at. I want to thank you all for your time this week. Please reach out if you have any questions. It's been a pleasure getting to know all of you so far, and I can't wait to get started on the content next week.